Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and as a longtime fan of the Final Fantasy franchise, the prospect of a new look at Final Fantasy VII has appealed to me for the 2 decades since I played the original game, which was actually my first PlayStation 1 game ever. Back then, I was still a relatively politically unaware child, and when I first played it, I just thought it was cool and edgy, and a lot of those deeper themes went straight over my head. In what may be the best days of my quarantine, I played through the remake and consumed a lot of media about this new game, and in doing so, I saw a lot of themes that I now recognize as revolutionary and very working class oriented. Because of this, I'm shocked, but not entirely surprised, that no one has talked about the politics of Midgar. So that's exactly what I intend to do here today. Final Fantasy VII Remake brings into even sharper focus the political undertones and characterization of the city of Midgar than its predecessor. This is in part because this game is only the very beginning of the original Final Fantasy VII, which took its story outside of the bounds of Midgar rather quickly. In this new take, we get to see the city characterized much more fully and the politics surrounding it much more fleshed out. You play as Cloud.
And then there was this crazy looking house, right? And it was all like trying to kill him. But then Cloud was all like, bam, bam, boom!
Your friend fought a house. A house?
A pro-capitalist mercenary formerly employed by Shinra.
Well, when we were kids, everybody wanted to be a soldier, right?
Yeah, I remember they were on the news every day during the war.
Thing is, by the time I finally made it in, they didn't need heroes anymore. It was nothing like what we dreamt of. It was just working for Shinra.
Who has just been hired by an anti-capitalist freedom fighter group that is fighting to save the planet from his former employer. Even though it is a bit of a simplification of the concepts of the story, it is not incorrect to say that Final Fantasy VII and the Final Fantasy VII Remake answer the question, what if oil was magic? This game takes this a little bit more literally by framing this magical essence, known in-game as Mako, as the actual lifeblood of a living planet named Gaia, by creating a larger metaphor for the environmental movement and the destruction of our world by oil companies. In the game, the planet is dying, and its people are suffering because of the extraction of this buried fuel source and the pollution this causes. However, with oil being magic in this story, the mutations are often not fatal in humans, and instead they turn the animals of this planet into literal monsters, as well as the people themselves, both literally and metaphorically. In this respect, the game takes a more comic book interpretation of mutation, similar to the tropes used around nuclear power instead of oil, but otherwise still fulfills a good metaphor for the capitalist oil industry that we know from our world. About half of the enemies that you fight throughout the game are either products of technology or products of the mutations caused by Mako poisoning the natural world. Additionally, some of the human antagonists, and even the main protagonist of the story, have been mutated by this magical source themselves through inhumane experimentation at the hands of uncaring capitalist overlords. The other half of the game's enemies are Shinra's private police force, but more on that later. Politics of Midgar. What about the politics of the city itself and its characterization? I guess the first question to ask is, does Midgar have a government? This is a particularly tricky question to answer because, as I remember, the word government was only used in the script exactly once. And even when the word was used, it wasn't entirely clear if the character was talking about a government in the way that we would understand it, or the Shinra Electric Power Company, which seems to serve in place of a government. Later in the story, you're introduced to a singular government official referenced in the storyline, the Mayor of Midgar, Mayor Domino. He seems to have no power, describing himself as an overglorified librarian, and the power that he does have was not given to him by the people or any sort of a democratic process. Instead, he was appointed by the Shinra Electric Power Company as a puppet to trick people into believing that they have any level of control over the city they live in. Instead of representing a government, he is more of a vestigial feature of the idea of government that has long since been absorbed into the Shinra Corporation. There's also President Shinra, but he serves in the capacity of the CEO of the Shinra Electric Power Company, which is not an elected position, but more as a member of royalty. He is, after all, one of the titular Shinras, and the presumed owner of the Shinra Corporation. And when he dies during the game, it is his son, as the vice president, who takes over the company, and through that succession, control of Midgar. The reality is that Shinra controls everything, and in this respect, Midgar is a bit of an anarcho-capitalist wet dream or nightmare, depending on how you look at it. As I said, asking if Midgar has a government is a tricky question, and this isn't the only or even the most popular hypothesis. Many see Shinra as an authoritarian fascist police state, and I'd certainly agree that it seems that way. However, without any regulation, all corporations tend toward monopoly the way that fascism tends towards monoparty. And if one corporation owned everything, including what little scraps are passed off in this game as a government, it would likely come to function like a fascist police state, using military force to protect its ability to extract wealth from all threats, foreign and domestic. We see this dynamic play out directly in the game's Sector 6 wall market. This area of the game operates independent of Shinra and without any rules or laws imposed on them. And yet, it is ruled with an iron fist by Don Corneo, one of the antagonists of the game. He has his own group of jackbooted thugs that enforce his will within Wall Market, and this abandonment of laws or societal structure leads to rampant drug use and a thriving sex trafficking trade that seems to mainly benefit Don Corneo and his men. This seems to solidify the idea that if capitalism is left without a centralized structure to impose decency and regulation, a society tends towards a singular ruler who enforces their own version of law on society even without a government, and in a way that is designed purely to serve their own interests. So if thinking of Shinra as a bunch of fascist jackboots does it for you, go ahead. But recognize that regardless, this is the future that anarcho-capitalists, perhaps better known as libertarians, want so badly to enable, whether they realize it or not. In addition to controlling the entirety of the power grid as the electric company of Midgar, Shinra also controls the police force, called public security even though they are owned and operated by a private corporation. And these are the people that you will have many run-ins with throughout the course of this game, but even that is not the full extent of their control over society. But to explain that, we first need to talk about the arrangement of the Society of Midgar. Social stratification exists within Midgar on two literal tiers. The lower class lives on the ground beneath 8 large plates that blot out the sun. Instead of sunlight, the underclass lives under artificial lamps that mimic the sun for the slums, where they often lament that they have never even seen the sky. The air in the slums is heavily polluted because along with their industrial look, the machines that power Midgar create a large amount of smog, which is pumped in through fans into the slums so that the people living in the upper class don't have to deal with it. Due perhaps to the nature of them living on the Earth itself, they have a much more direct connection to the planet, Gaia. As such, they have a native understanding of what Shinra is doing to their planet is wrong, and they look at this often without blinders, which is not to say that they're entirely woke, but the reasons for that we will address later. Midgar's upper class lives on top of these plates that blot out the sun, and this class is largely made up of Shinra employees that work in the multitude of roles that constitute Shinra as a whole. Their physical detachment from the Earth they ruthlessly exploit means that they are mentally and emotionally disconnected from what Shinra is doing to the planet on which they reside. However, I believe that they choose to remain unaware because it's in their best interest not to understand the implications of what Shinra's Mako reactors are doing to their planet. Most times you encounter Shinra employees during the game, they're portrayed as uncaring bootlickers that only care about perpetuating the system of power that keeps them in a state of wealth, whatever the cost. Their blatant self-interest is obvious, as biting the powerful hand that feeds them is a one-way ticket to a destitute life in the barren slums. The members of the upper class choose to remain ignorant of the ramifications of Shinra's actions and the effects of those actions on the planet because it benefits them directly to remain ignorant. Spoiler alert! Until now, I've tried to avoid spoilers as much as I could while explaining the political dynamics of this world. However, at this point I need to get into some storyline points. So at the risk of spoiling a game that's been out for over 23 years, at least in part, because the remake does shift away from the original storyline a bit, I'm going to talk about what actually happens in the game. For your first mission, Cloud and the crew place a bomb at one of the 8 Shinra reactors that power Midgar. This bomb is intended only to disable, not destroy the reactor, as the mission of the group, called Avalanche, is not to destroy Midgar, but to stop Shinra from extracting the life force of the planet. However, the president of Shinra, having kept a close eye on our protagonist, chooses to use their own internal security systems to detonate the reactor, a decision that costs many lives and causes much destruction within that sector of the city.
Attention all citizens. Attention all citizens. This is an alert from the Shinra Emergency Operations Center. Unidentified intruders have detonated a bomb inside Mako Reactor 1. Multiple explosions have been confirmed, as well as ongoing fire. In response, a disaster warning has been issued in Sectors 1 and 8.
The reason for doing this appears to be twofold. First, to undermine the morale of Avalanche, and possibly to kill them in the process. And second, to give Shinra a way to twist the media narrative and the way the residents of the slums view Avalanche, so as to force Avalanche out of the slums. At first, this approach brings mixed results, because many of the people in the slums see Avalanche as the heroes, although some do not. Some see them as dangerous terrorists, but even then, their connection to the dying planet helps them understand that what Avalanche is doing is ultimately right and beneficial to their long-term survival. I believe that while this adversarial viewpoint by some in the lower class is their reflexive opinion, they often choose to be flexible in their framing of Avalanche's actions and their sometimes harmful consequences. When Avalanche attacks a second reactor using a smaller bomb so as not to repeat the mistakes they made before with the first attack, Shinra gets cocky and reveals to Avalanche that they are being recorded, and that this recording will be broadcast to the people in a way that would frame them as the villains after the reactor is destroyed.
Okay, listen up, y'all. Everything Shinra has told you is a goddamn lie. Mako is the lifeblood of our planet. Those greedy bastards are bleeding it dry. Y'all gotta rise up.
Barrett, who are you talking to?
The people put me on TV. I'm gonna drop some truth.
Thousand Gil says they cut the sound.
Media, recuperation, and détournement. After this point in the game, Shinra uses the Shinra News Network, their personal media company, to demonize Avalanche by presenting a very edited and stilted version of their objectives to the people who support them the most. In doing so, Shinra attempts to both turn the slums against Avalanche and quell a potential revolution against Shinra's control over Midgar. Recuperation itself is something that's almost explicitly mentioned within the storyline of this game. They talk about a cute dog mascot named Stamp, which has come to represent Shinra. However, this was not always the case, as Stamp was originally much more innocent in nature. In this way, an evil company has taken innocent imagery to try to rehabilitate their image to the public by appropriating a friendly face. It's interesting to note here that Avalanche specifically takes this logo and embeds it in their graffiti, which helps them navigate the underbelly of the city, thereby reclaiming this symbol for the revolution. This process of turning capitalist symbology into something revolutionary is correctly referred to as détournement. Shinra's use of the media and the company's payouts to common people to act as pseudo-grassroots organizers speak to the methods discussed by Noam Chomsky in his 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent. What is a terrorist? The way that manufacturing consent applies to Final Fantasy VII is in the way that Shinra uses the media to poison the public perception of Avalanche as a group of freedom fighters into a group of mean-spirited terrorists that don't care who has to die as long as Avalanche gets what they want. It is sometimes a bit of a hard pill to swallow, but often the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist is simply a product of the media narrative. During the American Revolution, the British media most likely framed our American heroes as terrorists and as treasonous to the king. And yet, from an American perspective, we think of those people as revolutionary heroes and freedom fighters, even though they killed a lot of people and did a lot of things to scare a lot of people in ways that could meet the dictionary definition of terrorism. To take a modern-day example, there's a recent story about shoppers who were angry with rules that said that they had to wear masks in public, holding employees of grocery stores at gunpoint, and literally committing terroristic acts and threats in order to get the mask rule taken away. The governor of that state folded, and there are undoubtedly those who think of these people as heroes fighting for their civil liberties, to walk around and be plague rats. I'm getting a news update. And now someone has murdered a Family Dollar employee for asking their wife not to wear a mask. And still, the media does not refer to these acts as terrorism. But in using terror as a political tool to achieve a political ends, they literally meet the definition of terrorism. However, because their actions weren't dangerous to the capitalist system that animates the media, so far, media organizations have been slow to label them as terrorists. Meanwhile, when protesters do everything they can without employing physical violence to attempt to block the construction of an oil pipeline because this goes against the capitalist interest, they are first demonized in the media, and then the police blast them with water hoses, mace, tear gas, etc., commit violence against them readily because they challenge the capitalist authority. Where was that anger when a lone gunman was holding a grocery store clerk in emotional terror just so they didn't have to wear a mask during a pandemic? Now I hear you saying, but wait, Jackie, that was just the guy who's mad his wife got disrespected. He's not a terrorist. And maybe you're right. My point is that who is and isn't a terrorist is entirely up to how you frame the narrative, and in this respect we can have our differences of interpretation. If nothing else, I hope this shows you how arbitrary that line can be. But to the larger point, I think that people who are holding clerks hostages over these mask regulations are in fact terrorists. And while they don't belong to a particular terrorist organization, they do seem to represent a growing problem with stochastic terrorism. Even worse, since I initially released this video, armed Trump-supporting gunmen, seemingly taking their cues from Trump's tweets to liberate Michigan, have stormed the Capitol building and are effectively holding the state Congress hostage. After this, Congress refused to meet for fear of their safety when protests broke out in front of the building. Stochastic terrorism is when a vile idea spreads through people's minds like a virus until people begin to stoke fear and commit acts of physical violence in order to achieve a political goal. If I were to say that I had coronavirus and then walk through the halls of Congress and threaten to cough on everyone who wouldn't vote for Medicare for all, these would be terroristic threats, and I would be committing an act that could be defined as terrorism. Although for the many people who die without proper medical coverage every year, I might be thought of as a hero. And if just mentioning that inspired enough listeners to this video to actually do what I just described, then I would have inspired stochastic terrorism, which spreads best when an unhinged authority figure stokes fear and anger in the people and tells them to lash out. Even though there was no organization or formal plan, if the suggestion combined with distribution was enough to get some people to do it, and this stoked fear in order to achieve a political goal, that would meet the definition of stochastic terrorism. Wutai bots. It's also worth noting that one of the ways that Shinra manufactures consent is by creating a connection in the public's mind between the organization of Avalanche and the external nation of Wutai, which the city of Midgar was recently at war with only 5 years prior. Using their own private army, which Cloud seems to have been enlisted in. They use references to the war with Wutai as a shorthand to connect Avalanche to a group. that the people are hostile to in order to make Avalanche look like another enemy of Midgar itself, which makes Shinra's job of reframing Avalanche as a terrorist organization even easier. To give you a real-life parallel, in 2016 we did have a very serious problem with Russia using fake accounts online to try to influence the way that news stories were perceived by the American public, and that they attempted to use that influence to sway our election. But since then, it has become a popular media narrative, especially on channels like MSNBC, to take everyone who is critical of them and suggest that they are either a paid Russian asset or, if they exist online, a Russian bot. For example, when Tara Reid first came forward, there was a lot of speculation that she was being paid to make her accusations by some shady Russian organization. And furthermore, that the people who were using the hashtag #IBelieveTaraReid were nothing more than Russian bots with the sole intention of amplifying the fake story. Of course, while MSNBC certainly played a key role in amplifying the "everyone who disagrees with me is a Russian bot" concept, by the time the Tara Reid accusations started to come forward in the news nearly 2 months after the initial sexual assault was reported on Katie Halper's podcast, MSNBC could not ignore the story, and their audience picked up the trend for them. And of course, this isn't exclusively a liberal phenomenon. I'm pretty sure that people who have been to a protest over the last couple of years have seen themselves or their protest labeled as a paid liberal operation and been accused of being paid for their protest by George Soros, a billionaire scapegoat boogeyman and a conspiracy that's pushed by people like Alex Jones, Rush Limbaugh, and various Fox News hosts. My initial analysis of this conspiracy theory missed a line of dialogue from Biggs early on in the game where he speculates that the larger Avalanche organization may indeed be funded by Wu Tai. However, both the protagonists and antagonists of the game seem unaware of this. It's possible that Biggs just heard a rumor spread by the Shinra Corporation. Though, in the original Final Fantasy VII, the greater Avalanche organization was based in Wu Tai, so it's possible that this is true. However, given the ending, we have no guarantee that Part 2 will go this route. And what we do know for certain is that the people who are pushing this narrative believe that it is not the case. And even if it is, Barrett's Avalanche group is a splinter cell of the overall group that is certainly not based in Wu Tai in any way. The City of Bread and Circuits. In this section of the game, the chief warmonger himself, and none other than one of Shinra's executives, General Heidegger, says something that I found particularly interesting and illuminating. He boldly states that it is his intention to give the people what they want: bread and circus. As it turns out, it's actually a Roman phrase, in which circuses represented a superficial appeasement of the masses to keep them docile. A sort of mind-numbing entertainment, which also seems particularly fitting here. Though to me, this seemed at first to be an obvious homage to the idea that people need bread and roses, which goes all the way back to an ancient Chinese proverb, that if you only have 2 pennies, you should use one to buy bread and the other to buy flowers. This concept has been echoed not only in the Bible, but by poets throughout time. This idea of bread and roses took new life within the women's suffrage movement, with roses replacing circuses to replace the idea of mind-numbing entertainment with cultivated beauty. They also may have a lot to do with the representation of flowers in this game, coming in a unique decision to make a flower girl one of the primary protagonists of the story in a way that I can't think of any other story that really does. This idea was later echoed in James Oppenheim's poem Bread and Roses, which celebrated the women's suffrage movement. And since then, this phrase has been adopted as a meaningful and powerful symbol and mantra within the anarchist community, which strives to bring people both of these things, because of an understanding that the heart is every bit as hungry for beauty as the stomach is for sustenance. But Midgar is something different, which goes back to how I originally heard Heidegger's words and how I misread the subtitles when I first played through this game. I could have sworn that he said bread and circuits, which really does speak to the underlying philosophy of this game in a juxtaposition that's so powerful that I actually regret that the developers didn't think of it. Colonialization, industrialization, and indigenous society. Let's talk about our female protagonist. Aerith is part of a long-forgotten race known as the Ancients. This is seen within the game as a separate race of people who were perhaps the original people of Gaia, and who were charged as stewards of the planet. However, the Ancients were discovered by the precursors of Midgar civilization, and their connection to Gaia and understanding of how to use its magic was manipulated by these people to build the city of Midgar and the reactors which fuel it through that same magical source. They were colonized, their knowledge was stolen, and their practices were morphed into something unsustainable and a dark shadow of what it once was. In this, we see direct parallels to colonialism, and it seems like this story is intentionally set up to mirror what many indigenous cultures throughout the world went through and how they lived, and how their means of living were warped by their colonizers to eventually become industrial society instead of sustainable natural way of living that many of them practice. In Joanna Pocock's book Surrender, Midlife in the American West, she described a character named Phoenicia Medrano, who in a lot of ways reminds me of Aerith. She is the descendant of indigenous peoples, and like Aerith, she has inherited their knowledge of how to live in harmony with the planet. In a surprising twist, she reveals that she has been locked up by the federal government and is wanted as a sort of eco-terrorist. Why, might you ask? It's because she's been planting the native species of plants that her culture revered on public lands and cultivating them to collect their seeds so that she could continue their life as they are all in danger of dying out. She sees the coming end of the world caused by capitalism and realizes that her knowledge will become necessary when climate change makes our way of life even more unpractical than it already is. And for attempting to keep alive a part of the world that has been passed down to her and given to her to protect these native species of plants that were a part of what is across all the world a long-forgotten civilization, she is considered a criminal and wanted by the federal government. In her own way, fighting for the planet of Gaia is Aerith's way of fighting for the memory and heritage of her people against those who had taken it away from her, while killing her mother and treating her much like a lab rat. That is to say that in opposing Shinra, she is fighting for her own freedom in a way that is far more direct than any of the other protagonists. Why is Shinra pursuing the last of the ancients, you ask? Well, it's because profit-driven colonialism will never end so long as there are new territories to colonize. There is a legend that the ancients will one day return to a place called the Promised Land, which Shinra believes to abound with Mako energy. With Aerith being the last of the ancients, Shinra wants very desperately for her to lead them to this Promised Land so they can suck up all that Mako, obviously. It doesn't matter to them that this is possibly just a legend or a myth. It doesn't matter if the lands that they wish to colonize have been proven to exist or not, or even if the person whom they are willing to manipulate to take them there even believes that it exists, or that she believes that she can lead them there. All that matters is that there is profit to be made, and the systems which animate the world demand that they go out and make it. A flower by any other name. But to return to the bread and roses interpretation, you could say that in Shinra's view the roses are unnecessary, as beauty is without any inherent purpose. Instead, it can be replaced easily by technology. This belief acts as a metaphor for the philosophy of Final Fantasy VII, where technology is literally coming at the sacrifice of the natural world. So one of the questions that this game asks you is whether or not it is right to sacrifice the natural world for the sake of technological advancement, which is a question that we have to wrestle with in our world as well, as all of our technologies and the ways that they are created often create effects that are out to kill us on an existential level while destroying the natural world around us. It's also worth pointing out that this game seems to have a very specific obsession with flowers. It should have been obvious to me, but I didn't really get it until a certain scene inspired me to think about the juxtaposition of circuits and flowers in Final Fantasy VII. Even though the idea of bread and roses has been adopted by the modern-day anarchists, I don't think that it's entirely right to say that President Shinra is an anarchist himself, though it does seem that he has dismantled or at least subjugated the idea of government, or perhaps supplanted it with corporate interest, which is a very anarcho-capitalist take. If you happen to be scratching your head and wondering what an anarcho-capitalist is here, in America we tend to call them libertarians. Libertarian is also in most places technically synonymous with anarchist, but libertarians here in America have a very specific anti-government but pro-corporate philosophy. Now, to be fair, I don't think of anarcho-capitalists or libertarians as actual anarchists, because in my mind, an anarchist is opposed to unjust structures of power, which corporations certainly can serve as. But it also seems to be the opinion of many anarchists that what anarchism actually means is more simply reduced to the opposition of government structures, and viewing anarchism this way leaves a big hole for corporations to wedge themselves in exactly the same way that the Shinra Electric Power Company has in Midgar. In the opening scene of the game, we are meant to be amazed by the technological sprawl of the city of Midgar. It is truly fantastic and, to me, a nostalgic sight to behold. Which is why I failed to notice how bleak and desolate it was until the camera zoomed in on a single dying flower on a choked piece of earth surrounded by pavement, concrete, and metal jutting out of Gaia like a knife would stick out from a wound. In doing so, the game immediately begins by explaining to you that while Midgar may be a certain futuristic metropolis, that comes at the cost of the natural world on which it's built. We also see later in the game that the area around Midgar is a desolate wasteland that appears to have once been a green land of plenty. I believe that this suggests that the practice of extracting the magical lifeblood of the planet to power Midgar is also making the world around Midgar so incredibly desolate. But this isn't the only way that the game uses flowers and the natural world to make a point. The first act of selflessness that is demonstrated within the game is when a local girl hands you a beautiful yellow flower. Cloud is a mercenary indoctrinated into the views of the capitalist system he once served, and in this point in the story, he expects to have to pay for it, but she gives it to him freely and at no cost. This seems to shock him a bit, as he seems to be a person who sees nothing in the world as coming for free or without cost. In this way, the introduction of the flower girl who will become a protagonist in the story, and her act of freely giving someone a flower, are the first injections of a real socialist mode of being, even though it's only on a symbolic level. Seeing the thorns of capitalism. Cloud is stuck in a mode of what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism. He's trapped in an invisible cage of air, much like the flower girl literally finds herself trapped in just after they meet. The air around him is an invisible force restricting him, is this idea that because capitalism has become so ingrained in our society that it has become easier to imagine the end of the world, which also happens in the game when Cloud is given a vision of a meteor crashing into Gaia by the gods of fate, than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Capitalist realism is why when so many people are confronted with the notion that we could change, that we could become a socialist society, they say, but we don't do that here. We are capitalists. This idea is so deeply ingrained into their narrative of who they are and who they always will be that it controls the timeline and their fate, past, present, and future. There cannot ever be to them a socialist version of the world, because for now and forever, as an immutable characteristic of themselves and their destiny, they are capitalist. One way of understanding capitalist realism within our world is to look at the issues of climate change. Imagine a world where we do everything that is now required to reach a point where climate change stops or even reverses. This would be a world where you likely wouldn't have a whole industry of airplanes or personal cars or cheeseburgers available for every meal. It would be a world more dominated by gardens than factory farms or even factories themselves. Most every mass-produced good in your home might not exist in that world, or at least not in the same way. But our problem is that we can't imagine a world that's not filled with factories producing fidget spinners and all of the random junk that's sold to us on Facebook ads from Wish. And despite this being the only rational way forward for the survival of mankind, we find it easier to imagine the world overheating and turning into a red-hot ball of magma where we all suffer and die than we can imagining an eco-socialist world where we don't have the multitudes of mass-produced goods that capitalism and industrial culture has brought us. Later in the game, Cloud and the flower girl named Aerith are sent on a mission to pick flowers for a local community center that operates on a non-profit basis, and as such, Aerith charges them nothing for the flowers that she tends and grows around her house. As we see her interact with her fellow slum dwellers, we begin to realize that her character doesn't care about being paid for her service. She simply does things to better the community without worrying about payment, which is very countercultural to Cloud, who up until this part of the game was doing all of the work for a paycheck. In fact, for the first few chapters of the game, one of Cloud's most consistent lines is, "But when am I going to get paid?" When doing the side quests in the first part of the story, after being introduced to Aerith's connection to her community, Cloud goes on a mission given to him by the kids of the community center they're working with. They have some pretty serious and dangerous work that they need a mercenary to help them with. At first, Cloud's reflex is to say, "You couldn't afford to buy my help." But when the children say, "Well, in that case, we'll have to fight this dangerous monster by ourselves," he pushes down his capitalist ideals and agrees to help them for a meager sum that they can easily afford. I believe he chooses to charge them a meager sum so as to try to balance his ideals as a capitalist mercenary with his newfound appreciation for kindness and compassion introduced into his thoughts by Aerith's selflessness and generous acts at the beginning of the game and her acts until now. Redistribution of power. While we're on the topic of side quests, now is a good time as ever to bring up the only real chain of connected side quests to exist in the game, which are 3 side quests that lead you to one of the better items in the game if you complete them all. These are a series of quests revolving around a folk hero character known as the Angel of the Slums. This character is pretty obviously based on the Robin Hood story, and the Angel makes a living of stealing from wealth hoarders and redistributing their valuables to the destitute communities in the slums. It's also interesting to note that these missions are generally given to us by unsympathetic NPCs. 2 out of 3 times this NPC is a reporter for the Shinra News Network who's trying to expose the Angel and take them down for their crimes. I've got to admit, I've never felt so apprehensive about doing a side quest as taking the first quest in this mission line for this bootlicking employee of the evil company that I'm spending the entirety of the game working against. But this quest line subverted my expectations and really played a fool of that reporter in a way I enjoyed interacting with. As far as the side quests in this game goes, I think that this one adds the most to the story that the game is trying to tell us. And again, it leads to one of the better items in the game, so there's a practical reason to do them as well. Although, getting all 3 quests in a single playthrough is actually one of the trickier and more technical aspects of this game, but if you're interested, let me know in the comments and I may do a future video on exactly what procedure you have to do to unlock the second of the 3 quests required to get yourself the game's second elemental materia. Anyways, it's also around this point in the game that Cloud stops asking for the members of Avalanche to pay him for his help, but instead begins to help them out of genuine concern for the group, their cause, and the planet itself. This doesn't stop him from doing odd jobs to raise money, but he becomes less concerned with making money doing these odd jobs as he begins to emulate Aerith's character and the way that she compassionately acts for a community that needs help. In meeting her, she causes Cloud to begin questioning his capitalistic way of helping people and begin adopting a more altruistic way of helping people. This character development and professional growth all starts with a mission about picking flowers and the compassionate act of a person unconcerned with repayment. Sleight of hand. On the other side of the coin, we have how President Shinra views the world. One of the things that really scares me about President Shinra is that he really believes that he's doing the right thing for the people, or at least he seems to have convinced himself of that. He actually realizes what his reactors are doing to the planet, and yet knowing this, he justifies his actions in the thoughts that not acting would be worse for everyone. It seems that President Shinra himself is stuck in a mode of capitalist realism just like Cloud was at the beginning of the game. He can imagine a scenario in which he murders 1/8 of the population of his city more easily than he can imagine a scenario in which the capitalism that animates it is done away with without any need for murder. He can imagine a scenario where his machines finally drain Gaia of all its life and the planet dies more easily than he can imagine a world without capitalism. And unfortunately, this is a trap that many of us find ourselves in as well. This is scary to me because it seems to mirror reality quite a bit, in that our own oil companies have known that they were damaging the ecosystem of the planet as a whole since their own studies told them this in the 1960s and 1970s, and perhaps even earlier than that. But they force themselves to come up with a justification so they can continue a march forward, striving only for profit and progress in the same way that Shinra strives for the proliferation of power and circuits. Shinra and our oil companies are often willing to do some pretty terrible things to maintain their power. Even though the president preaches that he's doing what he does for the good of the people, he clearly doesn't care about their individual lives. Not just because he forces those whom he cannot profit from to live in the slums. Not just because he blew up 2 of the reactors just to frame Avalanche so that he could retain power. No, even later in the game, he commits an act of mass murder and drops one of the 8 plates on Sector 7 in an attempt to destroy Avalanche completely.
Are they gonna destroy our house?
In a plot development reminiscent of modern-day CEOs and politicians, he successfully reassigns the blame for mass murder, as taking personal responsibility would call into question the righteous justification of his power. Instead, he blames this supposed accident on the accidents of Avalanche, with the mass murder being the unintended consequence of yet another attempt to destroy another reactor. And the president is ready with a fabricated media lie to feed to the people in the slums who were most affected by this, in order to turn them against the parts of Avalanche that managed to survive. I strongly believe that today's Democratic Party operates in much the same way, fighting under the guise of defeating Trump, but doing everything they can not to nominate the one person who would best do that, instead choosing to nominate the person who would best help them retain their current political power. You can look at the zealous way in which Joe Biden continues to fight against one of the most popular political ideas in America, Medicare for All, because of the fact that his campaign is largely backed by wealthy donors from the healthcare insurance industry who don't want to see their industry disappear thanks to a powerful public option providing affordable healthcare to everyone when they could easily make absurd profits off of it. It may not be as flashy as an explosion, but the capitalist healthcare system here in America kills an estimated tens of thousands of people per year because they can't afford to go to the doctor when they get sick. These are preventable illnesses. And the industry itself is so bloated and cares so little about the people that hundreds of thousands go bankrupt every year because of the enormous size of their medical debt for life-saving procedures. It also leads to homelessness. A study of homeless populations in South Florida discovered that not only is medical debt the #1 cause of homelessness in the area, but health-related issues make up the top 3. This can also be seen in modern-day oil companies, which fight long and hard for their right to destroy the planet, even though it becomes more apparent day by day that this is exactly what they're doing. They've even gone so far as to infiltrate and recuperate environmentalist movements and organizations that oppose them in order to retain their dominance on the energy market at any cost, even if that cost happens to be human lives. In a world where profit and progress are gods, human sacrifice becomes more and more acceptable. The invisible hand. There's another aspect of Final Fantasy VII that I found fascinating. which is only available in the 2020 remake. The inclusion of ghostly specters, invisible to most, called whispers. According to the game's story, the only way that you can perceive whispers is if you've been touched by them. And a more literal interpretation of the game sees the whispers as breaking the fourth wall and being a representation of the Final Fantasy VII community's pressure for the game developer to stick closely to the original storyline instead of making a new experience for gamers. However, I also think that given the game's other themes, the developers might be trying to tell us that we could interpretate these manifestations of fate as the invisible hand of capitalism guiding us along. Or perhaps they more closely align with Fisher's invisible cage of air that is a hallmark of capitalist realism. The whispers actively resist our desire to change fate and actively dictate to us how we as individuals must move through the world. And even though it's well established within the game's story that these creatures are leading us to an apocalyptic level of destruction via the summoning of a meteor intent on destroying the planet, the whispers continue forcing our heroes down that self-destructive path and constantly blocking any attempts to change fate. The fact that the whispers exist to shape fate and are invisible to most makes them remind me of the overall structure of capitalism and how it shapes our lives. We have been born in this system, and our understanding of the world often comes directly from its manifestation. It is like the air that we breathe, completely invisible to us, yet affecting everyone's life simultaneously. Anytime we attempt to control our own fate, it is the invisible hand of capitalism that metaphorically holds us back in every way. And much like the protagonists of this story, those of us who have been touched by capitalism, especially those of us who have been hurt by it, we are the ones most likely to see the specter looming in the distance. We are the ones most likely to have visions of the apocalyptic future that it is leading us towards. Similar to the Shinra employees, there are many who cannot imagine their life in a way that would steer this away from this oncoming disaster, and therefore willingly choose to perpetuate the lives that they have now. They do everything within their power to uphold the system that enslaves us all, leading us all towards an inevitable death as a species. This is not to say that there aren't good people on the inside of Shinra, because the game goes out of its way to show us a few of them. But it also shows us their empathy being derided on by the powers that control Midgar. We often see them condescended openly by the president. So is it even that the president wants to give the people of Midgar bread and circuits? Or is it that the power company is solely interested in gaining and maintaining the power it currently enjoys? After all, they are the power company. I have a lot of people to thank for helping me turn this script into something that I can really be proud of. Two of my fellow leftist YouTube creators, TX Watson and Enzo Cadella of Sustainable Justice, helped me see even more of the concepts within the framework of this game and make better and stronger real-world connections to them. Nick Smith of Fulcrum Politics helped me with the editing and getting my grammar and flow into a really good place for this essay, and refining it into the gem that you just got to witness. He's also been an amazing friend, and I don't think that I would have gotten through this quarantine without some serious mental scarring without him. There's also Grassdad, a podcaster who helped me with some of the general concepts and editing that went into this, as well as a little bit of lore. I would also like to give a shout out to J100, a YouTuber and Twitch streamer who often does video game streaming and has streamed the original Final Fantasy multiple times. So I thought he was the perfect person to reach out to make sure that I got my lore right. And I think with his help, I finally did. Even if you're not into video game content, you should check out his channel because he's more than just a gamer. And last, and certainly not least, is Carl, who showed up in my comments to offer technical support when I said that my laptop had died, and after buying me some accessories and having them shipped to my house, in addition to spending several days of texted tech support, got my laptop back up and running to the point where I could even make this video. I also want to thank my patrons for helping make this channel possible. The newest among them is Artemis Rivers, who is going to be my first customer for one of my Fox hats, which I'm very excited about. There's also TX Watson, who has helped me with this concept and lore related to the script. Callie, who has been a big source of support for me over my time as a content creator. Holly Smith and Ranger Jenny, who were my first 2 patrons and helped me really kick off my patron page and have been giving me encouragement to keep going as a creator for the longest time of any of them. Last but not least, there are another 2 content creators for you to check out. Woohooligan Comedy, who probably is the person who shows up most frequently in my comments, so thank you for your help in the algorithm. And Swoletariat, who is the first person who was willing to host me on a live stream. Thank you for that, and thank you for being my socially distant personal trainer over this quarantine. So that's a total of 12 people, in addition to myself, who all came together to make this video possible. And it's really inspiring to me because I think that this community is ultimately the greatest strength of leftist culture, and it's something that I would like to see spread throughout the world. Now more than ever, we need to come together as a people and support each other as we begin to realize that the capitalist system and its subjugated government isn't going to do much to help us. Otherwise, we're only likely to slip into a dystopian nightmare like Midgar.
True beauty is an expression of the heart, a thing without shame, to which notions of gender don't apply. Don't ever be afraid